What's market today?
How's the market? It started a bit wobbly because of the supposed to be some a vote in Parliament, right? So I don't know what's the latest. I've not checked. Okay, Reza, Salam Tan Sri and DHH.
Is that there's a chat going on, is it?
Yeah, I'm just reading some of the chats. Yeah, people just saying hi to you. So okay, okay, I think we can start the session now. So I'll pass the floor to Ruzi, CEO of CGS-CIMB Malaysia, for her opening remarks. Ruzi.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon to all. I'm very excited to welcome you to our inaugural CGS-CIMB Thoughts Leadership series. In the spirit of aspiring for the greater good for future of Malaysia, we present to you Thoughts, a brainchild of CGS-CIMB. Thoughts is a social impact platform to address imminent issues affecting Malaysia and our investment industry. For this particular leadership series, we feature to you a premier event showcasing prominent individuals who have made a big impact and have big influence in Malaysia's investment landscape. As you know, Malaysia is currently facing a challenging time. Beyond our industry challenges to meet investment returns, Malaysians as a whole are feeling the economic pressure, either limited job opportunities, stagnant career progression, or perhaps loss of personal business. For the young ones, do not let this deter your initial expectations of entering the industry. We hope via this series, it will inspire you to continue to dream big, learn from previous success of our leaders, and see this phase as a stepping stone to pave your way to greater heights. We are honored to have with us today the one and only Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar, who is well known for previously helming Khazanah Nasional Berhad. During Tan Sri's 14 years period at Khazanah, Khazanah's net portfolio value grew by whopping 350% from 33 billion ringgit to 116 billion ringgit. While growing the portfolio, Tan Sri spearheaded various government initiatives along with bringing Khazanah to international stage, opening up offices in China, India, Middle East, and North America, among many others. The recognition was apparent when the World Economic Forum, Davos, invited Tan Sri to Board of Stewards, an honor that few Malaysians have received. While many here may know Tan Sri's impressive track record, prior to Khazanah, he co-founded a boutique financial advisory, Bena Fikir Sendirian Berhad, and prior to that was the head of research at UBS Malaysia and Solomon Smith Barney Malaysia. He started his career at Malaysia's national utility, Tenaga Nasional Berhad. We are also honored to have with us Datuk Hisham, the Executive Director and Head of Public Markets, Khazanah Nasional Berhad. Datuk Hisham too has his own impressive track record covering Shanghai market, which was brought one of the best contribution to Khazanah. Datuk Hisham will be in conversation with Tan Sri to bring out the best of his stories. For your information, Tan Sri and Datuk Hisham, the audience with us today consists of fund management fraternity, CIMB, CGS-CIMB personnel, along with bigger investment and corporate community within CGS-CIMB clientele. Without taking much more time, I would like to pass the floor to you, Tan Sri and Datuk Hisham, to share with us your leadership journey, wisdom, and unveil the reflection of an adventurous capitalist. Please do post your questions to Tan Sri on the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Yeah, thank you very much, Puan Ruzi, Saudara Rashdan, my brother Datuk Hisham, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Assalamualaikum, and very big pleasure for me and an honor too, and it's good to see CGS-CIMB taking the time and effort to do this knowledge sharing and part of your talent development contribution to the industry. It's also, I had a peek at the registration list, also great to see quite a few old friends, old kakis from the market, some from way back in the 1990s, as well as some of my former colleagues at Khazanah and related entities, as well as many young and younger folks as well. So thank you for coming. I hope today what Ruzi and Rush, and I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Carol Fung, the CEO of CGS-CIMB, as well as I think I saw Omar Siddiq, the Deputy CEO of CIMB on the list, also our ex-Khazanah colleague. So Ruzi and Rush wanted me to speak about my journey. So I asked specifically, what kind of journey is it that you want to talk about? So I understand it to be both professional and indeed a little bit of the personal journey through the investment and finance industry, and in particular to focus on, I think what Puan Ruzi had said at the start, which is there seems to be, some gloom and doom and so on and so forth about market and industry, etc. I don't know whether I've said that fairly, but I know that from the time I left Khazanah, which is actually more than 2 years ago, I just checked this morning through CIMB, CGS-CIMB. I think the market is still below. From the time that I left, it's about 7% below at these current levels. And at one stage, of course, earlier in the year during the pandemic, it was like 32% below. So I'm not sure that I miss a lot, but certainly the time away has given me a nice distance and perhaps time to reflect, as we all do during this crisis, right, during the pandemic. So therefore, in fact, I should acknowledge, while I was at Khazanah, as some of our colleagues will know, towards the end, I think that I should blame Dato' Hisham. He came up with this concept called leadership journey. So that Hisham, that he first of all got all his direct reports, and there were quite a few, to come up, to try and understand their leadership journey as a kind of a development tool, to look back. I think there are some theory and certainly a lot of practice. It struck me actually, as the CEO of Khazanah, you become like any CEO, you're also the Chief Talent Development Officer. And then when you run through that, I went through the leadership journey. So there were about 50, 60 who submitted. We didn't make it compulsory. But we found that I thought I knew my team. But when you read the leadership journeys, I thought it was amazing that what people go through, their turning points. It needed quite a bit of trust, because you're really kind of exposing yourself a little bit in that sense. But it was always in a very constructive way. So Sham, I then asked, and we kind of expanded that practice to other folks. And indeed, it also forced me to look at my own journey in many ways. So today, while I'll try to find the balance between the professional journey and perhaps share a little bit of the personal journey, I hope it's not too indulgent in that sense, but I think always with a mind to look at for our younger members of the investment community, that hopefully you may find it useful, so that you can take it further. Okay, the main speech that I've written for today is available through the organizers. I have some set of slides that are part of the speech that I will use for presentation today. So we'll start with this title that I've chosen, called Reflections of an Adventure Capitalist. So a little bit of a mouthful. In fact, the first draft was Confessions of an Adventure Capitalist, but I thought that was probably a confessional is probably not relevant at this stage. And really to start with the subtext of lifelong learnings of what has been a 40-year journey as a finance professional and counting, inshallah. And to start that, the term adventure capitalist, actually I borrowed from a 2003 book by an investor, a legendary investor called Jim Rogers, that some of you may know. He is now actually based in Singapore, has been for the last 20 years, I think. So Jim Rogers, or some say Dr. Rogers, wrote an account of how he drove around the world over 3 years in a souped-up yellow Mercedes. And this in itself was a sequel to an earlier book called Investment Biker, where he went around the world with his, at that time, young girlfriend, now his wife, to go around the world. I read the first book. I must say I didn't read the second one, but the first book is a really good read, because these are, essentially it's a bit of a travel log, going around the world, but it was also like a manual on global investing, as well as a bit of a kind of a place where he talked about his so-called life lessons. But I chose this title because I wanted to reflect the kind of sense of spirit and of adventure that I think we all should go out to break out of any gloom and doom that you may be experiencing. Okay. I also wanted to note that about 10 years ago, somebody introduced, and I met Jim in Scotts Road, Singapore. Basically, masa tu tengah jual tanah trying to get him to buy into Iskandar, Malaysia, just across the Selat Tebrau. And interestingly, a few months or a few weeks later, in Forbes magazine, I think it was, Dr. Jim Rogers' 3 top tips for the year were commodities, to invest in commodities, to invest in Iskandar, Malaysia, and to invest in North Korea. So we know at least 2 of those investment tips came through, at least for a while, right? But that reflects him, the maverick Dr. Jim Rogers. So in a way, that was an inspiration, to help write this journey, so to speak. So really, in my presentation, I wanted to structure this into 3 main areas. First section, to talk a little bit about my 40-year journey as a finance professional, both a personal journey, so allow me a little bit of background so that you understand perhaps how this builds up. The professional journey, and as per request by Rash and Puan Ruzi, to talk a little bit more about Khazanah and GLCs, although to be honest, you know the story quite well, but I'm happy maybe to take Q&A, and Dato' Isham is actually still a present member of the team, and so on, right? And then to the last 2 sections, which is managing your professional leadership journey and managing your personal leadership journey, I thought I should try and address for the professional leadership journey, like any journey that we take on, you got to understand the landscape, right? You need a map, so to speak. So I'll talk a little bit about global trends, about trends in the financial and investment world, and a little bit about Malaysia, the markets, regional, and so on and so forth. I must say, I mean, to update the last couple of years after Khazanah, until the pandemic, about 9 months ago, I was spending most of my time overseas, in the UK in particular, doing some visiting fellowships at universities, but also on various advocacy platforms, if I may say, like World Economic Forum and others. And also early this year, actually, I stopped giving free advice to my friends around the world, and they said they want to pay me. I said, okay, thank you very much. And I set up co-founded my own little consultancy, which has been incorporated in the UAE, partly because UAE is halfway in between London and Malaysia. So that part takes up some of my time, not much, but some of my time. And finally, going through that journey, you don't just need a map. I think I try to share some thoughts, some reflections, and perhaps some tools, compasses, if you like, about how to navigate this journey. And then we conclude, right? So I understand Ruzi and Rash, I probably have, if I can finish all that and leave about 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A, would that be all right? Inshallah. Okay, so the next point is to ask, let's try and unpack this a bit. Why do we call it venture capital? I think partly I've implied that already in the reference to Jim Rogers, but also to say that, it's not just about a return on investment on our professional journey, but also perhaps in respect of our personal journeys as to what this return may mean. In fact, some of you may be familiar that the work of, and Dato' Isham certainly knows this very well, the work of Dr. Clay Christensen at Harvard University. And interestingly, Harvard, of course, one of the top universities in the world, so-called, The most popular lecture, the most difficult lecture to get into is actually Clay Christensen's lecture, which refers to how, I think it's called, how do you measure your life?
Yep.
How do you measure your life, actually? So if you were to measure your life, and you know, these are so-called overachieving kids, students in a place like Harvard, and of all those thousands of lectures that they can attend, the one that actually demands, you know, has the most kind of waiting list people want to attend is Clay Christensen's lecture on how do you measure your life. He basically says three things: be happy in your job, be happy in your relationship, especially with your spouse, and stay out of jail. I think it's a little bit more than that. But, you know, in many ways, this reflects on our adventure capital journey. You know, we need to consider that, you know, there is more. There's, of course, much more than our careers, right? But then let's try in that regard. And also maybe not a coincidence that when we reach our annual milestones, which are called birthdays, we usually get the greeting from friends or family that says many happy returns. So maybe it's not a coincidence. So the many happy returns refer to your return on whatever capital you deploy in the year just past and perhaps in the year ahead, on the years ahead. So in that regard, let me try to very simply define what I call adventure capital. I think there's 4 components. The first one is very obvious, which is the physical capital. And the usual literal definition of capital, which includes money, you know, land and property. You may own companies, plant and machinery, that kind of stuff, right? The second is also quite obvious, intangible capital, which means, what are these? These are your networks, your own human capital possibility, what some may call your IQ, your EQ, or even your AQ. AQ usually refers to adversity quotient. I also wanted to add that AQ got 2 conceptions. One is adversity and the other is actually how do you manage altitude, actually. Your altitude quotient, that means your proclivity or your propensity to manage high altitudes or altitude. Your health, your family and friends, the quality of your life, your many relationships. And most of all, your intangible capital is actually your name and your reputation, actually. And this is precious, right? But that's not all, actually. If you consider that time itself is our capital, and that, of course, subject to whatever our destined portion, our qada and qada of our allotted time, we all have, and this is the great leveler, right? That everybody's got the same time, and of course, how much quantity and quality we get out of our time, of course, varies greatly, right? The efficiency of the usage of this capital, of time as capital. And finally, and we know this, but I thought I'll put it up to frame this, that I think it's so important that we should put this down as a form of capital in itself, which is not just time as capital, but freedom itself as capital. And perhaps this is the great gift of choice and free will that we were born with. And indeed, free will, if we think about it, is fundamental and unique to us as a species and the essence of being human. While it's also true that in the world today, many are not free, or at least not completely free. And indeed, there is much, as we know, as so obvious in 2020, so much social injustice, inequality that restricts the amount of freedom and access to basic rights, including education, healthcare, social mobility. It's also fair to say that with much progress all over the world, and certainly over the last 4 decades, for the great many of us, and including all of us on this call, this freedom gives us actually a great range of possibilities and opportunity, actually. I know it may not seem so oftentimes, and indeed often we, including me, do not fully use this freedom, perhaps out of fear, perhaps a lack of courage, perhaps of being in too many comfort zone traps, or just that it's a cumulative onset of things like, you know, inertia, neglect, apathy, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, it's a fundamental point about adventure in that if you combine the physical capital, the intangible capital, time as capital, and indeed your freedom as capital itself, the nature of adventure is that usually if we stay true through to our principles, the good principles of adventure, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There is always a multi-splendid world just around the corner, actually. An exciting path or a road. Often these roads are less traveled, admittedly, but nonetheless it's there. And I think it's fair to say that many of us, sometimes out of various reasons, I mean, there may be so many reasons that we don't quite take this on, don't even dream about it, don't even think about it. So perhaps today for a couple of hours, let's just dream a little bit. Okay, there's more to be talked about this. What we were born with, what we have right now is really a sum total of what we had accumulated, that capital, to what we have experienced. But more importantly, is going forward, right? So, oops. Okay. Actually, at this stage, there's supposed to be a photo on something else. Yeah. I don't know why it's not here. Okay, this is the section on Khazanah. But before that, if I may, I think I got my order. I wanted to highlight about how little bit about my personal journey. And I have to start with this photo, actually. Okay, this is MCKK Library around 1978. It has a beautiful photo of a typical afternoon in MCKK Library in sometime in 1978 when I was in Form 5. And my journey into finance really started around here, because round about 1977 in Form 4, you had to choose which stream to take, right? And those of you who grew up in the 70s, maybe not many on this call, but some of you did, you would know that this was the age of what the government called at that time science and technology. Because our young nation basically needed more engineers, quantity surveyors, doctors, architects, etc. So very much, emphasis was on that. But my and a few others, decision-making framework was basically, at that time, there was not much by way of career guidance. And essentially, my decision at that time was driven by which stream, science or commerce, as it turns out, gave you the most free period, actually, the most time to lepak, to be very honest. Not because we were lazy, don't get me wrong, but it was because in those days, many of us were quite busy running less inside the class, but outside the class, right? The extracurricular activities was basically where the interest was more. So library was often used as a time to catch up on sleep. But the reason I wanted to highlight here is that this gentleman in the middle is Dato' Iskandar Samad, is currently an Adon, a member of the State Assembly of Selangor. He's a past Adon, by the way. We didn't expect that from his behavior in school. And these two gentlemen who are flanking him are both CIMB alumni, actually. Nick Adlin and Ruzal, one was in the commercial bank and the other was in the investment bank. Rather successful entrepreneurs, I must say, today. And the point was this, that adventure, the spirit of adventure, I sensed early on that it was just as important to achieve things inside the classroom as it was outside. So outside the classroom, for example, the playing fields, the fierce debates, the drama productions, the fights, refereeing the fights, and most of all, the human interaction with your other bright, high testosterone boys. And these boys have remained friends and brothers for life. And I think this, if you talk about your own personal journey, if you reflect back, for me, unabashedly, of course, I work with many non-Malay college boys as well, and girls and ladies. But certainly this was a foundational part of that journey. So thankfully, in spite of all that, I did do enough to earn a scholarship from LLN to study in the UK, to study ACCA, and I did, graduating in 1983. Somehow only 4 years after finishing my MCE, which is therefore MCE, which is SPM today, which is fairly short, I would say, but to note that one of my MCKK classmates, Ahmad Zaki Zakaria from Kelantan, not only he didn't do it in 4 years, he did it in 3 years, and he even won the top prize for ACCA Level 3 globally. I think Tun Musa Hitam was Deputy Prime Minister, even sent him a letter. So I must say, while I was in the UK, I was more interested in traveling, in hitchhiking in particular, and various other extracurricular activities that due to time and other reasons, maybe I shouldn't talk here. And these are, again, great sources of future lessons, leadership lessons that you pick up over the years. So the rest of my journey is kind of known. I think it's in my short bio, which I've attached as one of the references. Basically, I somehow decided to serve my 10-year scholarship bond in LLN in Tenaga, and recognizing that, you know, with a profile of an accountant, ACCA, Malay college background, and I was playing rugby actually quite seriously to a fairly high level, to the state junior level even in the 80s. This is a typical profile to be recruited into the pre-98 crisis kind of a corporate landscape lah. Some call it the crony landscape, right? In those days, the Renongs, the MRCBs, and so on and so forth, and Celcom. In fact, I even went out and took a 5-day, what do you call it, cuti, leave from Tenaga to try out to become the 4th employee of Celcom. And then I went back to, somehow I went back to Tenaga, LLN, basically feeling that this is not for me for whatever reason. At that time, nobody had a mobile phone. This was Celcom around about, I think 1988, 89 or thereabouts. And interestingly, many years later, I became chairman of Axiata, right? So you basically kind of, you know, Celcom was the main, one of the main, or if not the main subsidiary. So anyway, cut long story short, in spite of quite a few job offers, I somehow remain in LLN Tenaga. Sometimes I reflect back that perhaps this is part of my journey that you know, I didn't know at that time that one day you were going to be, you know, head of Khazanah and running the GLC transformation program, and you really need to understand, you know, companies, typical GLCs like Tenaga, Mas, Telecom, and others. They're not quite a company, like it's more like a country. And I think I was going to make a short comment about, I don't know, you guys will know better whatever's happening or not happening, the power plays, pun intended, in Tenaga right now. So I hope that lands properly, whatever is the outcome. Amir is a good man. Like his late father, who the Tun Azizan was a great inspiration as we built our journey at Khazanah later. So anyway, so later I entered stockbroking, investment research in '94, and it was relatively late. The industry, like today, I think remains a fairly young one in the sense that I was in my early 30s, but I had served, alhamdulillah, and one of these themes about amanah, which is about trust. I think you have responsibilities in which you need to discharge. And I think I served my time in Tenaga, UBS, and then Solomon. So alhamdulillah, during this process, I was lucky to ride several really big and good waves, including, see, out of the blue, Tenaga became the largest stock on the KLSE. And then the 1990s, of course, saw the mother of all bull runs. I became head of research at UBS by round about, I think it was like 95, 96 or thereabouts. And then at Solomon during the Asian crisis of 97, 98. So even the crash was a source of good fortune eventually, because Solomon Smith Barney participated very much during the crisis management and then recovery as a financial advisor to the government of Malaysia. So this was during the capital control period, Dana Saham, Dana Harta, headed by Kaping, and I was Yo Kaping, Madam Yo, who later I invited, and she joined the board of Khazanah before I left, right? So Solomon during this time, and I was lucky, as I said, we learned a lot during this time. In fact, I would even say that we learned even more during the crisis. So in between, while working and raising a young family, I managed to earn a couple of qualifications additional to my ACCA, reflecting my own growing curiosity and professional interest, and a bit of adventure because it varied not just in finance. I took on a graduate diploma in Islamic studies from the University Islam Antarabangsa, UIA, as well as a CFA qualification. And if Cochlin, if you're on the call, thank you. I think Cochlin and Amal Gill were my two signatories. Amal Gill is at BlackRock now, I think, from the 90s. So actually, this is one article from that period, which I wanted to highlight. Some of you were around in 2017 when we had this 20-year anniversary of the 97 crisis. The Edge ran kind of a pull-out section, and some of us wrote articles in this. I don't know whether Kate Singh's on the call and Cochlin. I think people like Steve Hager, Guna Segaran, and others. So it's all in there. And again, this is available if you're interested in the references. So that's a little bit of my kind of a personal journey, if you like. I forgot to mention, the background is I'm actually, my parents were teachers. We were fairly middle class. We didn't have much by way of luxury, but we had a lot in terms of essentials like books, food and stuff like that. And I'm very grateful for that. Okay, the Khazanah story, the next section. Again, I won't bore you because you know this quite well, as well as, it's been a couple of years since I left. So I captioned this really during the 14-year, 2-month period when I was there. I think then, you know what, I don't have to elaborate for this audience of what Khazanah is. But, my colleagues and I, we managed to kind of treble the value of the portfolio. We were often called a sovereign wealth fund, but actually not quite correct because we did not have sovereign wealth coming in, which is fine, as in not the duit minyak, not the oil money, of course, goes to Petronas, not the pension money, of course, managed very well by EPF and others, not the foreign reserves, again, managed well by Bank Negara and others, right? So what did we have? We had a bunch of companies, some your traditional SOEs, the Tenagas and telecoms of the world, but also some that came through the Asian financial crisis, the formerly Renong, etc., right? That became UEM and so on and so forth. So we basically grew it by a bit more than 3 times and at a level of risk that we thought was acceptable. And we also, I wanted to highlight over time, what we did, kind of evolve to be sharper in the sense that, instead of a sovereign wealth fund, some people called us a sovereign development fund. The reason being, throughout that 14 years, we basically look, of course, as a fund, principally at financial returns, but we also had to handle and think through what does strategic or economic returns mean in terms of new investments into new sectors, in terms of national projects, in terms of special economic zones like Iskandar, how to regionalize or internationalize our companies, and to build the intangible capital within our group and within ourselves in terms of knowledge, human capital, and so on and so forth. And then the distribution part, right? How do we measure and think through about societal returns? Of course, corporate responsibility is one, but what can we do or do? And these are some of the institutions that were created, and I'm happy to see that these are still going in strong, because one of the process of institutionalization is you try to plant trees whereby the so-called shade continues long after you've left, and indeed whether Yayasan Hasanah or the Trust School program just turned 10 years, the park I think is doing well, the Research Institute, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. So therefore, the financial returns are here, and it's not just Khazanah and the numbers, but we also were the, what do you call it, the secretariat for the GLC program, transformation program, because of course this includes companies where Khazanah did not have shares, but we were the secretariat, and therefore the challenge was to come up with a framework to implement this, and then I'll talk a little bit about this, the famous or infamous rainbow-colored books, etc., etc. And the numbers suggest that these companies that were kind of underperforming for perhaps long periods of time from the 1990s onwards began to outperform slightly, and in some cases outperform a lot. It was not complete. Of course, my one thing I could not solve, which I'll be happy to talk about later a bit, is Malaysia Airlines, as you know. But there were about 20 companies, and about 18 of them, I think we managed to do I think quite solid restructuring. It had a 10-year program. By 2015, we said cukup lah, takkan to have a 15-year transformation program, for example, is a bit ridiculous. That people should be adults and run their own thing. And indeed, around that time, we could already see that performance was slipping, was stagnating somewhat for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about later. So certainly financial returns. Again, economic strategic return, there's a lot here, and Dr. Hisham, I'm sure, can talk a lot about this internationalization, moving into sectors, including, I think, the technology trends. We opened in San Francisco. We started investing in the real economy in China, and along the way stumbled into the internet economy, and got in, I think, relatively early, and it's been both profitable and a big eye opener in many regards, right? Certainly the various national things and the various knowledge things, and then we had talked about the corporate responsibility and the social inclusion. Okay, the GLC program, as I mentioned just now, I think my estimate is that the total, this is today, AUM and the 5 GLICs and market cap of G20, I don't know, Sham, I don't know whether I got that right, it's approximately about 2 trillion ringgit if you total them up. Maybe a bit of double counting here and there, market cap and the holdings of the GLICs, right?
Yeah, right.
But, so that's not small. Of course, the governance is dispersed. So that's close to 500 billion US dollars, and approximately a third of the Bursa market cap. In fact, arguably, we have to look at the question of whether it's crowding out or crowding in. I think it's something that needs to be discussed. So this chart...
You have 10 minutes before we need to go to Q&A. So just to let you know.
Oh my God, okay. Okay, this chart I just wanted to put on record that the balance of the so-called political economy between state and markets is something we need to consider. And I won't go through in detail, but basically, whenever there's big upheaval like 69 or the 85 recession or the Asian crisis or the global crisis, the pendulum seems to swing between, more state or more markets, whether privatization, etc. And during my time, I saw my role as partly after the Asian crisis to bring the C in the GLC to become a bit more C. Of course, we need to look at the G and so on and so on. And of course, the 1MDB crisis, GE14, and now COVID, etc. So the point is this pendulum swings. And I guess we are in this period now that is, we can talk about clarity or lack of and so on. Again, interest of time, I've recorded here. This is from a recent presentation. Other countries are interested in this experience, and this was a presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago to Sri Lanka. With they have the new government, Rajapaksa is back. I think they wanted to know more about this. Turkey, for example, has started a wealth fund. It's run by the CEO, is a Khazanah alumni. But essentially, it's a long game about getting the mandate right, getting the capacity building and drivers right, and getting the execution right. We can cover some of this in Q&A, but here are 10 factors that if you ask me, from the trenches, so to speak, these are what I see as the main drivers. And another way of looking at Khazanah, and this is from a little speech I gave back in 2015 as part of the CEO faculty lectures. I'm still an adjunct professor with University Technology Malaysia. So it actually came from a speech I gave at a Credit Suisse forum and later at a Bursa Invest Malaysia about 12 ideas that was shaping Khazanah then, grouped into 3 areas. Getting the mandate right, what we call doing the right things, getting the value creation right, and then getting the governance right, which is doing the right things in the right way. A lot of, and 9 of these actually have become lectures on its own. I was going to complete the last 3 during COVID, but inshallah, hopefully next year I'll complete it at various universities around the country, right? So I won't go through that. So the next section, actually, I wanted to run through briefly, Sham. So request additional 5 minutes.
Yeah, go ahead.
About the various trends, right? This is the second section. So I do, a bit of this in Cambridge and other places. But, many ways to look at this. But here are, it's quite obvious, 7 mega trends, so to speak. And the one we wanted to focus on is on finance or financialization. And the point to make is that obviously we do live in financial times, so the FT is at least correct on that. Financial crisis has certainly increased. And now, even before the pandemic, finance capitalism and the rise of inequality and, it's not 10 years now, it's 12 years post-Lehman. I think it's not a surprise anymore when people say finance has kind of lost its way because finance is supposed to support the real economy, and the real economy is supposed to go and serve society, right? But somehow those relationships have kind of fractured or broken even, and even more perverse. Sometimes it's the other way around. There's a feeling that, the society is supporting big business and big business is supporting big finance and so on and so forth, right? Now, some of that is not true or exaggerated, but there is some truth in all that. And to an extent, I think you need to understand these landscapes. I've given, and this is actually the bulk of my work in in Cambridge and other places. And I wanted to highlight this chart, for example, needs a bit of updating, but these are some data that if the global GDP was about 80 trillion, the amount of financial stock out there is at least 5 times more. And you can't really measure the stuff in the derivative markets. If you look at money supply, in fact, you should take this chart back to 1971 when Richard Nixon went off the gold standard, etc., etc. In fact, the stock of money, as you know, after pandemic, the amount of bonds out there, I think has grown from I think almost double and so on and so forth, right? So certainly this is neat. So, and this is some summary that basically there's a fork in the road. We know the problem. I think the solutions, many are grappling, whether it's stuff around profit with purpose, ESG, impact investing, B corporations, taxation, etc. Long story. But I just wanted to make this point that we should put that on the table, right? The trends in finance. Later I'll share the text of the speech. I think we'll have more elaboration about these trends. But in the interest of time, I thought I'll try. Let's land this now. This the second section, which is I asked myself, what would I do if I were 25 or 26 years old today in the finance industry? And I came up again, many of you will know better, but this is putting all the trends together. So first of all, our homeland, Malaysia, I think the comment I would say there seems to be much structural constraints in the local market. You will know this better. Commissions are, I think, much smaller these days than 20 over years ago, or even 10 years ago. There's much lower weights in MSCI emerging markets. When in the 90s, Sham, it was, 15, 20% even. Today, the number is 1.6 or something like that, right, percent. So smaller comms on smaller weight, right? And it's hard to see where the new exciting companies are coming from. Sure, the glove companies for a while, so that sounds more cyclical rather than structural. There's slower growth, slower reforms. There's large and many in this Zoom call, but relatively narrow pool of institutional capital. The retail interest looks nice, looks good. My brother, Tan Sri Awo, I joke with him when he became Bursa chairman, suddenly meloncha with all the retail interest. But you will know better whether this is really sustainable or not. And perhaps one indicator is that, in any healthy market, the so-called market for corporate control, otherwise known as mergers and acquisition, must be active, or what Dr. Isham will say, the sharks must be out there to instill discipline and performance in companies, right? But I observe, and many others observe that today, and I don't know whether in Parliament today, but certainly political M&A seems to be more active than corporate M&A these days in the Malaysian market. So this is not healthy. We want it to be the other way around, right? That political M&A is stable, and then therefore corporate and other kinds of good M&A can take place. So to me, it seems obvious, therefore, if we think some of the structural constraints will remain for quite a while, or because the world, of course, moves on, then, it's an obvious point to diversify and reorientate, to add to regional and global to Malaysia. So CGS-CIMB, for example, I'm sure you took note of this, and before that, CIMB and GK Go, that the need to go regional and to collaborate, right? Now, what these platforms actually look like, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's China, whether it's US as well, cryptos, gold, etc. In terms of products, I think you will know better. The second part is I gave a talk recently to KLBC, Datuk Faiz Azmi and gang. Basically, the key message is that all this ESG stuff, actually, we've only just begun, actually. We've only just begun, such that I think there's a bit of a hype cycle. And like any hype cycles, there is also all kinds of things in there, lah, macam-macam, before it settles down. So for example, you talk about greenwashing, as you know, everything now people claim this is impact, a bit like property developers, kan, jauh pun still call Damansara, kan, that kind of thing. No lah, maybe, but you get what I'm trying to say. So the point is that the next stage, I think, is to overcome greenwashing. The next curve is people will demand more authenticity. So therefore, this trend, I think there is a career to be made in not just investing, but also in related areas such as measurement metrics, right? So my colleagues and I at Khazanah, we were fairly early actually in this. We had something called Project Kronos, trying to measure what we call true value, so to speak. For those who are in Islamic finance, my own view is that we need to be closer to its real essence of being so-called Islamic, which is in equity rather than in debt and in positive impact of the economy, right? So Islamic social finance as well, such as zakat, wakaf management, actually should be exploding during these difficult times and the difficult years ahead post-pandemic, actually. And finally, beyond the hype cycle, I think there's real promise in emerging investment styles and teams. So fintech, but not just any fintech, but good fintech. So for example, I'm not particularly keen on fintech lending, or lending platform that increases over consumption or over indebtedness. But certainly good fintech, when combined with things like financial inclusion, micro insurance, how do you unlock the SMEs and the micro enterprises and so on and so forth. It's obvious, some sectors are obvious or seem to be obvious, healthcare, life sciences, especially the intersection between life sciences and digital, to me is a very clear next frontier, if not already. Renewable energy, new ag tech, affordable housing, education tech, all seems to be obvious. And you basically need to combine this with true purpose and good tech, so to speak. Another trend, I think quite clear, as governments, not just in Malaysia, but everywhere, becomes more fiscally challenged and politics become more uncertain or even nativist, as the current term goes. The state and markets pendulum, I think, will gravitate back more to good entrepreneurship. So during the course of the lockdown, one of my private little projects at home, my children, I think, wanted to know more about business. So I did like a 10-week series of what we call the Country Heights MBA. So other guest speakers. So one of the guest speakers was Afzal of Time.com, who's also a board member of CIMB. And I didn't realize, actually, so Afzal was our partner, that he grew Time.com by 28x. I don't know what's the latest number. This was like 1 or 2 months ago. So that's incredible, Sham, 28x. We grew our portfolio by 3.5x, but he grew it by 28x. So I think there's something to be said about entrepreneurship. While I'm known as promoting GLCs, actually I have no issue. There's a time that is a little bit more G, there's a time that is more C. But certainly where the pendulum is swinging, I think those of you out here with many more years ahead of you, you should be thinking about entrepreneurship and good entrepreneurship. It's not for everyone, granted, but I think you should at least think about it. Now, PE and VC capital is, of course, somewhere in one of the intermediary roles. So the above trends, as well as the huge amount of liquidity, the low to negative rates right now, suggest a return to more active alpha chasing investment management. And this somewhat bucks the recent trends of passive investing. So it should be good news for active managers in theory. So those are some thoughts of what I think I would look at if I'm 25 again. So this is the final section of looking at the personal journey. So I wanted to share a few tools. This is a chart I did for young Mekoba asked me to speak. The first tool I wanted to share is a perspective of looking through cycles. Don't ask me why 7-year cycles, it's a long explanation. But it's also something my colleagues at Khazanah will know. I've talked about this several times with my direct reports. It's about this actually, because one of the ingredients of success, I believe, is to have a clear long-term horizon, right? Whether it's a company or investment, right? And actually to try and understand cycles. It actually started the first 3 cycles as an infant, a child, a teenage. This actually started when me and my wife attended a nice talk among friends as young parents. So this would have been 30 years ago or 20 years ago, of how to raise kids actually. And the speaker, Dato' Fadilah Kamsa, you know, a very nice man, a kind of a motivator. So he said, as an example, the first 7 years of a child, they need most of all love, because otherwise problem again, the so-called secure base. But the next 7 years, if you just give love without discipline, jadi manja lah, they become spoiled, right? And after that, actually, they need to go out. You cannot hold them back so that they explore and learn. And really, you need to be like buddies with your kids, otherwise you lose them. So, but the talk stopped there. Then I speculated about what if I were to kind of extrapolate that throughout the whole life cycle, so to speak. But to consider that, for example, your first job, in my first job, you know, I advise a lot of, you know, direct reports and staff and so on. Really, you know, you need to make sure that you have diligence, you have honesty, and then you have the drive. And then, you know, by the time you're 35, in your mid-30s, of course, some people earlier, some a bit later, that you are an emerging leader. If you talk about leadership journey, you're building your family, you're doing your team leadership in the 7-6 cycle, and by the time you get so incidentally, I became MD of Khazanah fairly young, I suppose, at 43 in this 7 cycle, where one thing to know, I call this prime time 1 because when you are in your early 40s, in theory, well, you have the energy still, you have some maturity, not fully matured. In fact, often your energy takes over your maturity, like you get angry a lot, but you still have the drive, right? And really, as you build that into this prime time 2 of maturity, you tend to empower more. But along the whole way, you need to maintain, obviously, things like integrity. And then I think I'm here now, you know, you become more of a steward and you're thinking through. You know, of course, this is a guide, as I said, but it's something for you to consider, to think through as you plan your journeys ahead and perhaps reflect. Oops, okay. Now, then I'm often asked, how do we develop? So the second tool I wanted to share, and there's only a few more, is this triangle, trying to reflect what actually required. So I thought about the 3 A's. The first A is aptitude, second is attitude, and the third A is actually altitude. So the aptitude part, I think maybe we can define this as the basics you need to enter the door, so to speak. The academic qualifications, some basic, of course, some basic competencies like integrity and so on and so forth. And perhaps you can reflect this as a kind of, this is your IQ, so to speak. So you must have certain basic aptitudes, obviously. And all of you in here, you definitely have this, because otherwise you wouldn't be hired by CGS-CIMB or any of the other organizations, right? But really, how far you go up here is by far a result of not just your basic aptitude, because everybody has that, more or less, but it's really how far you go, quote unquote. It will depend more on your attitude. And as the saying goes, your character is ultimately your destiny, as you know. So are you a team player? Do you have the energy, the drive, the motivation, the integrity, etc., right? So you need to build on the basics, including qualifications, new skills, and certainly EQ, right? You need it here. Now, even when you so-called get up there, whatever the up there is, and sometimes it's somewhat overrated, believe me, often the hardest test is actually to manage the altitude, because, you know, people get vertigo, people get, anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. So the power, the amanah, or there's all kinds of people around you. So managing achievement and success is often harder than managing adversity and failures. I think the famous poem by Kipling, If, I think he refers to both triumph and disaster as imposters, right? In that famous poem, which I'm sure many of you know. The great medieval Muslim scholar, Imam Al-Ghazali, actually says life is just oscillating between sabar and syukur. Actually, when you are in hard times, you just have to be patient, work at it. If you are doing well, then the only medicine is really to be grateful and to remember, so to speak. So there's two kinds of AQ. The usual adversity quotient, but also altitude quotient. Okay, I don't have that much time. I think there's two more triangles. So quickly run through, because this, I don't mean, I don't want to be preachy or anything like that, but to be honest, especially in the last 2 years, I've been working a lot more with younger people, with various groups. Honestly, these are very anxious times, and I did not realize, the numbers on mental health, for example, is soaring. There's a lot of stuff, not just during pandemic. Jadi tadi I spoke about Clay Christensen, or indeed people like Jordan Peterson and others things. So people are searching. This is the issue of purpose and meaning, right? Again, these are kind of touchy-feely subjects. Everybody may have their own point of view. I can only share what I see. And really, to me, to find meaning, really, you need to ask the question. You have to locate ourselves in what is important to us, right? So I try to define this in 3 relationships. I think the first relationship is our relationship with our Creator. So, most of us, if not all, believe in God. Actually, I work with a group called Global Ethical Finance Initiative. In the UK, majority of people now are actually non-faith. So when we engage, we have to talk in non-faith language. But even non-faith punya group, they have an ethical framework. In fact, this group is based in Edinburgh, and this is the home of the great moral philosopher Adam Smith, etc., in the great Scottish Enlightenment punya tradition, right? So we work, including with the Church of Scotland, Church of England, as well as the Islamic Finance Council of Britain, right? So anyway, I think you need, and for me, for us, of course, as Muslims, but also for others, so this is a relationship that you have to define. You're the servant. We are the servant to that relationship with our Creator, right? So the second one is our relationship with our fellow humans. Of course, we have many roles: son, daughter, husband, wife, mother, father, sibling, and so on. And here, to me, the best among us is really if the one who are most useful to others, to be of most service to others, and that's a hadith, by the way. Be most. So here, if the first one is one of servant or khadam, this is one of khidmat, actually, service. And the third one with other creation, the relationship is, and this is not just the obvious environment, but also the social systems, society, economy. Here is actually a duty of care and justice in being a steward, actually, Khalifa. So 3S, right?
2 minutes, Chief. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, almost there. So this third one is actually related to the second one, is to ask, therefore, what are the spheres that you need to balance? Obviously, your way of life, what we call deen as Muslims, this is the belief system. Your family, I think is very important, and your work, which is essentially your amanah. Okay, so in conclusion, we've talked about venture capitalists. I've shared a little bit about my 40-year journey in finance. I shared about mapping the landscape and making some thoughts and possible recommendations about what I would do if you're 25 again. And then managing personal journeys, so not just the map, but some tools. So in conclusion, use your capital well. My children tell me, YOLO, you only live once. I have to remind them you only live twice because there is an afterlife. So be holistic. Life, to me, my conclusion is most of all is a beautiful trust that we all have to discharge in various ways. But most of all, not to forget, is to seize the day, to be courageous, be adventurous, but be anchored on good principles. So good luck. Thank you very much. And actually, there's a list of references of longer articles if you're interested. All these things are made available through the organizers if you want. The soft copies are there. So all the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tan Sri Azman. So we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. We got a few questions that are coming through. Chief, maybe I just kick off with the Q&A. So, I mean, the audience here are basically asset owners from PNB, Co-op, EPF, asset managers from private, a lot of private asset management.
Yep.
and also intermediaries like CIMB. So essentially, as you said about mental health, from time to time they will ask themselves why I do this job, right? Purpose of, those days maybe, as Rashdan sort of smiling, maybe market was busy, they had no time to think about why are we doing this kind of job, right? Nowadays, okay, this year been busy, but there are moments, I guess, I'm sure the young people and also the oldies in this industry wondering what the social function of, whatever they do. That's sort of, and also the role of mega trend, and we can talk about it. But the two questions right now that we have is one from Shan, Shan Kamal, talking about, this is a bit sensitive, so be careful what you answer this, asking your comment about the glitz of the government sort of moving away from being the sharks, or rather being active and moving into passive and more sort of portfolio shareholders rather than sort of being active in active parenting, especially say company like CIMB, IH, RSB, Maybank, and so on. That's number one. The second question, anonymous, is something about in central bank trying to solve all this aggregate demand growth, lower interest rate, therefore increase inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor. And question is, how do you solve it without going through the Great Leveler book, i.e., the four horsemen of the Great Leveler book, military conflicts, revolution, disease, and things like that. So those are, maybe you want to address that first.
Siapa tanya, Syam? Sounds like your question.
No, anonymous. I did not know. The second question about the Great Leveler solution.
Right. Ada lagi? Shall we group them or?
Yeah, why don't you do that? And we got question coming. I think that would be.
Yeah, I think yeah, Shan, how are you? I'm in touch with your mom. I think you've left Value Cap, I hear, and all the best in your new endeavor. Yeah, how to comment on glitz, what do you call it? Moving. I think I'll try and answer by, sharing this chart again. As I said, I think the moment we talk about glitz or G or GLCs or the G in GLCs, we can't run away from, again, I don't want to over, intellectualize or whatever you call it, this chart, but, before we call about economy, it was actually called political economy, and I think Datuk Nazir, in his widely circulated speech baru ni, betul lah tu, Malaysia doesn't really have an economy. He says it's more of a political economy, but you would know that the original, conception of economy from the so-called classical economists was actually called a political economy. This is Adam Smith and Ricardo and all those guys. But actually and this answers partly the second question, before you talk about political economy, it was actually called the moral economy. In fact, Adam Smith wrote the theory of moral sentiments before he wrote the Wealth of Nations. In fact, he rewrote the theory of moral sentiments after he issued what became a bestseller, Wealth of Nations, because people tend to take certain parts of Wealth of Nations and forget the moral economy part, right? So in respect of the political economy and glitz and so on and so forth, I think, to be honest, I'm not surprised. In fact, I do get asked around the world, even, as I said, including by governments, about the Khazanah experience. And I'm very honest to say, I said, look, every country in the world that's got, lots of oil has an oil company, right? National oil company, including Petronas. Even then, we are not OPEC member, right? Every country in the world with a financial system, that means every country lah, ada central bank, right? Bank negara, but not every country has or need an active fellow like Khazanah or indeed Temasek or others, right? So in other words, it depends, and I really mean that. And I know Turkey decided to do one, the Turkish Wealth Fund, but I remember chatting with Ali Babachan when he was Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, and he said, we don't really need a Khazanah equivalent in Turkey at that time, right? So now Erdogan feels he needs. So I think you have to understand in that context. So I'm quite cool in the sense that, while me and my colleagues built an active manager, because I saw my role as part two of after the Asian crisis, we needed to, number one, repair a lot of the companies, including the formerly non-SOE companies that went into the GLC stable, right? I think we by and large did that, as I said, with a notable exception of the likes of MAS. Even Proton, I think we did as much as we thought we could. And then we sold it. In fact, Dato' Isham ran that deal to Syed Mokhtar, Tan Sri Syed Mokhtar punya group. And I'm glad, and we sold it at more or less break even, which I thought was a great deal for Khazanah. And since then, with their partnership with the Chinese, it seems to be doing well, or better certainly, right? So I think just that, all I say is that whatever strategy you do in whichever side of this pendulum, nak kena coherent lah. It must be coherent, right? Second is to ask, when our time in Khazanah, we had to take, these key companies after the Asian crisis, So the stabilization measures, capital control, dana harta, dana saham, apa semua ni stabilize. Tetapi many of us may recall CDRC, for example. Many companies will still start, including the likes of Time.com. So it needed active managers, and that was our first role. Our second role was, some were not in the category of hidup segan mati tak mau. I think these were companies that were kind of okay, but underperforming, right? The Tenagas of the world, hence the transformation program. But third, the mandate given to me and my colleague was, can you go and drive performance, or rather drive the boundaries in both sectors and geographies and go out? And I think we did that to an extent. But now, and essentially looking at various measures of success and performance. So now it appears it's narrower or more commercial, and other parts of government, I suppose, are supposed to do all those parts. Whether they are doing, difficult for me to comment, just that I think I made my comments in terms of those structural constraints that the country seems to be going through. So Shan, I hope that answers to an extent. I think, one, it is situational based, and two, within that situation, what's an appropriate strategy or mandate to apply, and number three, within that mandate, the execution, there must be internal coherence, obviously, and that one maybe Dato' Isham is more well positioned to explain if need be. The second part, long topic, for those of you who may not be so familiar, there's a book which I have not read, but I picked it up. The book is called The Great Leveler. It's by a Stanford professor of economics who basically tried to answer the question, if you study history around, recorded history, how many thousands of years, inequality has always been around, sometimes more, sometimes less. Of course, the kind of fabulous wealth that you see, and every year we see the numbers from the likes of Oxfam and others, right? Between, 100 people own more than half of the world's wealth and all that. So the only way in history, according to this guy, is that the four horsemen of apocalypse, war, pandemic, I think it's revolution, and something like climate crisis, can actually become the great leveler, right? So these are rather, big, disruptive, disorderly, violent even changes, right? So it's quite a pessimistic view. On the other hand, you look at what is the great transformation story in our lifetime over the last 100 years is China, actually. So China, of course, you see Deng Xiaoping punya great transformation, which is amazing. If you have a chance to go to Shenzhen, apart from all the amazing stuff, there's a lovely museum there that looks at. So Deng started with Shenzhen, and then it spread throughout the rest of China, right? But sometimes we forget that before Deng, there was, of course, Mao Zedong, and so on and so forth, and the Cultural Revolution, and 50 million people died, etc. So today, I think, again, how to answer this is that, I think the low interest rates essentially is a wealth transfer in many regards. Low interest rate means higher asset prices. Higher asset prices mean things like property becomes out of reach to many, many people, especially those who are entering the job market, if they have jobs, etc., etc. Again, I won't have time to cover it here, but in my slides earlier about, I think these are some of the ways that we can begin to look at it. And perhaps this is a call for those of you here in finance. If you read some of the commentaries and recent books around the meritocracy trap and so on and so forth, actually, finance not just lots of capital, it also sucks up a lot of talent, and many of you on this call. Actually, this talent, apart from doing all that, actually could be out there doing other things that are more socially useful, right?
Rashdan should be engineer.
In fact, have you seen the movie Inside Job? It won an Oscar. There's a Malaysian in there, Andrew Sheng, my dear board member, Khazanah. So Andrew had some of the best lines in the book. Only two Asians, Andrew Sheng and Lee Hsien Loong, were in that movie. So Andrew, one of the best lines where he said, financial engineers build bridges, blah, 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 all these things, right? Whereas financial engineers, what do? They blow up the world. Maybe, okay, that's a slight drama, but some truth in that. So my point is actually, like, I don't know, Gandhi said and all that, be the change you want to be. I think it's a long story, this one. There are some pointers. So for example, impact investing, deploy all that billions and capital, right? But through impact investing, go into Islamic finance, but through Islamic finance, not some kind of, halfway house kind of finance, right? I'll stop there.
So Chief, the more questions, we have another 15 minutes, so we have probably another 5-10 minutes, and then Rosie has to close. The next two questions, personal. Somebody asked Fabian, do you have pivotal books in your life, and what are they? That's number one. Number two, from your good friend Gerald Ambrose, which Spurs manager would you like to be compared to? Bill Nicholson, 58-74, Glenn Hoddle, 01-03, Pochettino, 14-19 to 2019, and the current Jose Marino.
Okay, thank you. Jerry knows where all the buttons are. So I kid with my wife that my first love was actually my football club. But my enduring love is, of course, my wife. So she's not here, but just in case she's listening, or maybe there's spies in the audience. Pivotal books, a lot. I think maybe unfair to answer in a short space of time. A lot. There's a lot of books. And to be honest, I've not really thought about it. So if you allow me to pass that question, I think those young really interested, maybe can rush. You can share my email or whatever they can contact. I think I need a bit more time to think that through. Tottenham, yeah, I think it's important, and all that balancing act. We all must let off steam once in a while. And I think my version of risk management is I put kind of my ups and downs really into watching football. And I would say, Jerry, the current manager has grown on me. It helps that we're top of the league. Who knows when in 2 days' time, I think we're playing at the Isham punya Anfield. But really, I think it's a composite because a reformed Jose can be actually quite, what do you call it? Could be quite formidable. Because this guy has certainly got amazing talent. So the adventure capitalist part, his problem is actually, he goes off balance quite often from a sense of ego and other things, right? But he's been humble in his last couple of jobs, so now maybe this is a perfect fit. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
The next two questions, maybe quick one before we close. Feel free not to answer this. Okay, something about the impact of political climate to corporates in Malaysia, and how should the youth think about positioning themselves for the future corporate Malaysia? That's number one. Feel free not to answer this if you don't want to. Second question is, for you, what's next in the corporate world?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to answer. I think, I think one of the good things about GE14 is, as a nation grows and as we hopefully become more mature, is whatever happened or didn't happen under Tun Mahathir's government or PH government, I like to think the space for discussion, media even is better again. It's more open, and it should be. And I think so. Bottom line is, I think one lesson from this 40-year journey, maybe exemplified by this chart, it's not just those GLCs, but certainly the broader market and the broader economy. You can't run away from politics and the power equation, so to speak. Every country got different kind of power equation. Thailand is going through whatever they're going through. Indonesia before Pak Joko and SBY before that, right, went through, quite a few presidents, and once they stabilize, I think we're going through that period. So to me, if it's not the current climate, there'll be something else lah. That's a given, and it's naive to think that these things won't affect us. Of course it does, everywhere again. And actually, you look around the world, pun macam-macam lah. There's a lot of issues, right? US, UK, even China underneath all that, as Xi consolidates power. So I mean, I stated my views and about, the structural constraints, about how this political M&A is not healthy, and therefore, until that settles, how are you actually going to go out to do things? I stated my concern about Tenaga and whatever else that represents, and not just Tenaga, right? Quite a few other SOEs. The 1MDB debacle, I think clearly it was not part of our program at Khazanah, the GLC transformation. Some say it should have been, but that wasn't my call. That was really up to the national leadership at that time. In some ways, the political competition market worked through the ballot box in GE14, I suppose, whether GE15, as and when. So can't really answer except to say that, sure, we are not an island. Everything else operate within that power structure. And we as a nation, and all of us as citizens, I suppose, or part of that process, should try, if we can't be part of the solution, don't be part of the problem. Don't add to the problem. What's next? I think, to be honest, I gave myself a couple of years after leaving Khazanah. Penat, running public office for a long time and all that, the whole career. So I had a great time, spending a lot of time overseas. The first year was just getting more into the academic side of things. One thing I know is I don't want to be an academic. I don't think I'm cut out to be a full academic, but one foot lah in there at that time, and probably remain a few toes in there. Early this year, I opened up a small consulting business co-founded with an ex-colleague. And actually, people, I don't really market services. People come, minta advice, some of it, and so on and so forth. And that's nice. I think back home, really the COVID crisis also, in a way, the last 9 months have been, sitting down at home, spending, precious, lovely time, family, reading, and so on and so forth. I don't know, in January, inshallah, I'll turn, next month, actually, I will turn 60. So I was going to make some decisions then, but to be honest, no big hurry. I think while doing this presentation also forced me to think a bit about the so-called journey and the tools around that. And like you, inshallah, I'll find a few good curves, including some of those that I suggested myself. So with that, Syam, Rash, Wan Ruzi, and everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief. Ruzi and Rasdan.
Thank you. Ruzi, yep, okay. Please go for closing, and after that, I have a few housekeeping to announce. So.
All right. Wow, it was very insightful and very interesting reflection, life lessons and trend analysis in the Tan Sri. Looks like we are at the end of our discussion today, and I would like to give a big thank you to Tan Sri and Dr. Hisham for the delightful and heartfelt conversation that you have shared with us. I would also like to thank all participants for your enthusiasm, warm engagement and support. We hope that you have gained new inspiration and have brought back key takeaways with you on how to best chart your way to achieve your goals. We hope we enter the year 2021 with a renewed hope and enthusiasm. May we see a speedy economic recovery for brighter days ahead, and not just for ourselves, but for the community that we live in. This is the only start of many more thought series, and we hope to see you again in the next one. Wabillahi wa taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruzi. Thank you, Ruzi. Yes, okay, to all participants, we will be sharing Tan Sri Azman's slides via email. I think it's very, very powerful, deck that he has come up with. So we are happy to share with, of course, Tan Sri's blessing. And then
sorry, I wanted to highlight there's also another Google Drive. So one Google Drive is a speech.
Okay.
Right, and there's another Google Drive for those interested.
Okay, excellent.
Some background further readings if you're interested.
All
Which
right.
I've highlighted here.
Okay, and also to both Tan Sri and Dato Hisham, probably if you can provide us with your list, top 5 lah, if not top 10, list of books, then we can share that with participants as well. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, all the participants, Tan Sri, Dato Hisham, Ruzi. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you again in our next thought series in January. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.